not doing all of this today, obviously. We're just going to get it started looking at the part that deals with Washington. So some of you know this even. So the differences between Hamilton and Jefferson, continue to get kind of worse and worse and worse until eventually Jefferson will resign from Washington's cabinet. What does that mean to resign? He quits because he feels he can no longer sort of, go along with it. Like I said, Washington tends to side with Hamilton. We like to say, that he didn't have a political party, but really and truly he was a Federalist. So that eventually results in Jefferson's resignation. And while I said there really is not like a specific point where you can say political parties exist, a lot of historians will point to Jefferson's resignation at the least to be sort of a symbolic representation of when political parties exist, as to when that division and that disagreement had grown so great that Jefferson felt he could no longer support Washington and leaves to eventually run against him. There's where we definitely have a clear definition. So again, Jefferson does eventually resign from Washington's cabinet not too long after the whole Whiskey Rebellion situation. Today, what we're going to look at now, looking at foreign affairs, foreign issues, is kind of moving backward a little bit. So Jefferson's still in the mix, but seeing how Washington responds and sets some very, very important precedents here. And we mentioned, major precedents yesterday. About how the president should deal with foreign countries and foreign relationships, and definitely sets the United States on a particular path here that the United States remains on for a very, very, very long time when it came to foreign relationships, diplomatic relationships, our place in the world, and our place in our reaction to things that develop outside of the United States. So, the first kind of big event that the United States sort of doesn't have to respond to, but something that kind of begs the question, how is the United States going to react when major events are happening in the world? What is our place going to be in that? The first big kind of earth-shattering event that takes place, that it's not a question of whether or not the United States ought to be involved in it, but more of a question of how does the United States kind of feel about it? What is the United States' position on it, particularly people in the United States, was the French Revolution. So, and our purpose here is not to talk about the French Revolution itself. We are not concerned right now with what this was about and what, all those different things. I know did that in world history. Our purpose here is to, again, look at the United States' reaction to it. Not are we going to get involved in it, but how did Americans feel, and what was the United States government's sort of stance on the changes that were taking place in France with the French Revolution? Having said that, just to remind you, this happens 1790s. You probably remember from world history, French Revolution, the people rise up, what happened to the king? They eventually, execute him. But basically, they overthrow the monarchy and attempt to establish a democratic government, much like the United States. And in fact, when the French Revolution first got started, you may recall that it was based on some of the exact same principles. The whole idea that government's power comes from the people and so forth, that people had rights and that monarchy was not consistent with that. In fact, Jefferson helped the French write their version of a Declaration of Independence. So it shared very closely some of the same values and same beliefs as the American Revolution did. It was in many ways inspired by that. So again, the question for the United States was never, do we get involved in it? But some people felt differently about it and disagreed on whether or not the United States should take a moral stance on this and what stance that ought to be. And as you might have guessed, that tended to be divided amongst party lines. So let's take a look at how one political party viewed the French Revolution and their attitude towards it versus another. So the Republicans, or this is Jefferson's crowd. Remember that Jefferson actually assisted the French in getting this thing off the ground. And they are quoting, and using some of the same language that was used in the Declaration of Independence, which, by the way, Jefferson wrote. So what do you think the Republicans' view and Jefferson's view of the French Revolution is going to be? They support it. The Republicans definitely were always, at least for a long time, big supporters of the French and see the French Revolution as exciting almost flattering that this is exciting and this is, this is a great thing that should be supported, that France is essentially doing what we did, that our ideas are catching on. We have inspired other people to, resist monarchy. And we have inspired other people to fight for their rights and all those kind of things. They would have thought that was really exciting and great and would have said, we support what the French are doing. Again, they are Republicans. They believe in a true republic, and France was trying to establish a republic. They're excited that these things are starting to move worldwide, and they would like to see the United States support that and encourage that and say we should be on board with those changes that are taking place. The Federalists, however, now the Federalists at first were on board when it first got started. Because you may remember when the French Revolution got started, it was very much like the American Revolution, same kind of thing. But you may recall from world history, eventually the French Revolution takes kind of a weird turn, one that the American Revolution did not take. Do you remember that whole reign of terror business? What was happening there? Yeah. They did. They executed the king and the queen among. That's how it got started. You remember that whole guillotine business? What was that? Execution. And remember how they were just executing people left and right? Like it was just crazy. And specifically, what kind of people do you remember they were executing? It was the aristocracy. It was the upper class. It was the rich people, exactly. The Federalists, while they may have supported this at first, they stopped supporting it once it takes that really radical turn. Because eventually, like I said, the French Revolution goes off in a very violent and bloody and strange direction that the United States American Revolution did not. And that's when the Federalists say no way. That's when they back off of it. Because they think that it went too far, that it was too violent, it was too radical, it was too extreme. That was too much when they went too far the other direction. For the Federalists, remember, they believe that the common people, the regular folks, can't be trusted with power, that they're violent and irrational, and they would look at something like the French Revolution as proof of that, to say this is what happens when you let those people rule. This is why there's got to be kind of authority over those people. You're going to get bloodshed and mass executions and anarchy. That's what it ends up with. And they see the French Revolution eventually as nothing less than anarchy, and that it's just chaotic and crazy. I guess you could say that, but it's a belief in no government. I guess you could say if you have that, then that's technically I don't know. So, chicken before the egg kind of thing. And they certainly don't want that spreading to the United States. They certainly don't want that kind of democracy coming to the United States. They don't want those ideas starting to spread around. And you also have to realize this: if it did, and that kind of thing was happening, who would have their head on the chopping block? They would. It'd be some of them that would be targets, because they were the wealthier classes and all of that. So they saw, themselves probably directly threatened by that. So they tend to be more against the French, seeing the French as being too violent, being too crazy, can't be trusted. And certainly the French Revolution created a level of chaos within the French government that, the United States never got anywhere close to that. Where it's very, very unclear exactly, who is in charge for a long time. So, but again, this is more of a philosophical thing. This was never a question of whether or not the United States should get involved in it, but it does affect the way American people feel about France. Either people saw the French as, hey, they're like us, they are like our brothers, we're one and the same, we think the same things, we believe the same things, or they saw the French as radical and crazy, and you couldn't trust them, and we stay away from all that business because we don't need that coming over here. Well, all of that needs a more direct answer when a little bit later in the 1790s, in the Washington presidency, when Britain and France, like they have done so many times before, end up going to war. So that presents a more urgent question for the United States. What do you suppose that question is? Do we get involved in it? Do we get involved in it, and whose side do we take? And getting involved may not mean like sending your military and such, but taking a side. Who are you going to support in all of this? And as you can see, the French Revolution has affected how a lot of Americans feel that way about that. What do you think the Republicans want Washington to do? Support France. Republicans say we'd be supporting France. Again, we don't necessarily mean let's go send our army over there, but to say that that's whose side we're on. They would say that the French are like us. We need to be supporting them. They would also, as some of you may already be thinking, be pointing out the fact that France, helped the United States, and they would argue that that alliance is still valid, that alliance still exists, and the United States is technically bound to support France in this fight. However, others see France, like we've already mentioned, as being just too crazy, would actually support Britain in all of this. And I know some people go, well, how would they support Britain? We just got out of a war with them. Yes, but that there's not, while the relationship is not great, there's not necessarily open hostility there. And a lot of people also saw, Britain's a pretty powerful country, certainly a powerful economy, a trading partner that we've got to have, so it is in our best interest to have a good relationship with them. So just because they just fought a war with them doesn't mean they're still, wanting to fight them. Oh, yes. Yes, definitely. So, yeah, that's a short answer, but yes. So feeling that we need to at least support Britain, at least stay on their side for reasons for trade and good relationships and that kind of thing. And they would also argue that alliance with France is no longer valid, that was an alliance with a French government that no longer exists, that government was overthrown, and so the treaties that had been signed, are meaningless. Washington's ultimate solution to this is he issues what is called the Proclamation of Neutrality. Now, what this is and what this says is pretty darn simple to understand, but it is also important that we understand why it's important. What Washington's doing here in the long run that has such great effect. First of all, what does it mean to say you are neutral? Don't take a side. So, what is Washington saying about the United States in this conflict with this Proclamation of Neutrality? We're staying out of it. Okay, we're staying out of it. Not just that we're not going to commit troops and money, but we're not taking anybody's side. We are neither for or against anybody. We are neutral. We have no opinion. So as a country, as a government, we're not taking sides in any of this. This is an important precedent that Washington is setting. I mentioned yesterday that there's lots of precedents that Washington sets as the first president. This is one of them. And that is staying out of foreign conflicts, staying out of foreign wars, not getting involved, not having permanent alliances. That is something that Washington saw as crucial. Now, obviously, that's not going to be one that holds true forever, but it takes a long time to get from this to where the United States more is now. And we'll see it get kind of chipped away at a little bit at a time. But this is a path that presidents after Washington will continue to maintain, with some deviations, yes, and some more than others. But overall, we have to be neutral. We got to stay out of stuff. It's truly not until the 20th century that the United States completely breaks away from that. And even then, using that same language, this is the way we do things. We don't get in that stuff, doesn't have anything to do with us. We want to maintain good economic relationships with everyone, so we are neither taking Britain or France's side. So staying neutral, saying we're not going to get involved in this stuff, we're not going to get in, make alliances with people for military reasons and all that stuff, that becomes a precedent. Washington is also in a way setting a precedent here, in that he is sort of helping to define the president's power here, because Washington decides this on his own, that this is what we're going to do. He didn't ask Congress about it. He didn't ask Congress to do it. He said, I'm the president and I am deciding that this is what we are going to do. And that is kind of more where that understanding of the president directing foreign policy, the president making decisions regarding foreign policy, that more comes from, or just as much comes from, Washington's actions as it does from anything the Constitution actually says. So again, it's not the Constitution doesn't say that. It's not like it says the president can't do this, but this is Washington's interpretation to say this is, part of the president's prerogative to decide the direction that foreign policy is going to go. So he's, setting that precedent as well, and that the president and only the president is in charge of making those kinds of foreign policy decisions. Now, the thing about neutrality is that it's easy to say that, and this is going to be a constant, ongoing thing. You'll see it over and over and over again, pop up every now and again, even into the 20th century. Saying you're neutral is one thing, having that be maintained is another, and upholding that neutrality is a completely different thing. And so we will find that's very difficult for the United States off and on and from time to time. This starts immediately because that Proclamation of Neutrality was certainly not welcomed by either Britain or France. They were both upset that the United States wasn't going to take their side or wasn't going to stand against their enemy. And so this starts in the Washington presidency with Britain violating and not respecting American neutrality. Because what neutrality is technically supposed to mean is that the United States, as a neutral country, can conduct relationships, can trade, can do business, whatever, with both of these warring countries without being penalized, without being kind of brought into it, without any kind of repercussions. And that particularly relates to trade and economic relationships. So Britain starts to violate and not respect American neutrality mainly by seizing ships, seizing merchant ships. What does that mean, seizing ships? Taking the ships, yeah. So the United States is trading or trying to trade with both Britain and France, merchant ships going back and forth across the Atlantic. And what would happen is that the British might stop ships, and they might take the cargoes, and they might confiscate things, or they might refuse access to their ports, saying you're trading with our enemy, we're at war, and you're bringing stuff to the enemy, and you're trading with them, so we're confiscating it. All of these are violations of neutrality, technically violations of, supposed international law, and could be considered grounds for war. Washington, of course, doesn't want to do that, realizing that going to war with Britain again at this point in time would not be a good thing, but also realizing that it's important that the United States stand up for itself, and say, we're not going to allow that kind of thing to happen. It's more like an understanding, sort of more gentleman agreement kind of thing. I mean, it's not like you've got some kind of international court, and there certainly wasn't any sort of, international organization. It's just sort of like an understanding. Okay, so Washington's solution, and this is going to be something that's going to be ongoing. We're going to see this happen with Adams and Jefferson, Madison, and it varies as to who exactly is doing it and how they respond to it, but it's either going to be Britain or France or both of them at some point. And eventually, these are going to be things that will eventually lead to the War of 1812 under Madison. So it's not going to go away. It might, put a Band-Aid on it. So Washington's solution is he is going to try to negotiate, try to work this out diplomatically, and that's going to result in something called the Jay Treaty, named for John Jay. So John Jay, remember him, over to Britain to try to work out an agreement, the Jay Treaty. And I'm not going to go too much into the Jay Treaty. I'm not going to ask you to know some of the specific things were in it. It's very, very technical. But know this, that the Jay Treaty was very unpopular in the United States, extremely unpopular in the United States. It almost didn't even get ratified by the Senate. A lot of people felt it just simply did not do enough, and that the United States was just kind of walked all over, that Jay pretty much gave Britain everything that they wanted. It did not demand too much of the United States. It kind of puts, like I said, a Band-Aid over the problem, in that Britain does start seizing ships for a while. But there's other things that they don't agree to, and I realize I'm being vague here, but if I go into more detail, it just gets confusing for no good reason. So it was very, very unpopular. It does kind of smooth the relationship over, at least for a while, not forever, but it caused a lot of division and a lot of anger in the United States, and people that felt that this was ridiculous and that the United States had been taken advantage of again, so forth and so on. So kind of solves it in the short term. It's not going to solve it in the long term, and it causes lots of problems. That division over the Jay Treaty, and we're almost done today, I promise. Division over the Jay Treaty, plus all the partisan bickering and probably several other things and personal reasons, eventually lead Washington to decide that he will not seek a third term of office, and that he will retire at the end of his second term. Keep in mind, retire at the end of the second term. I'm not talking about he's not resigning. He's just not going to seek a third election. Now that right there was also a major precedent that Washington set. There's another thing that he does that then kind of becomes the standard, and that was serving 2 terms, stepping down after 2 terms at the most. You may be thinking, well, I thought they had to quit after 2 terms. They did not in this time. The Constitution did not originally include term limits for the president. That's a 20th century thing. But that was the unofficial rule for a long time before it was the official rule, because people wanted to follow Washington's example, except for one. There's only one that ever served more than that, and that's when they put the term limits in. So other presidents, if they even got to the second term, a lot of them only served one, but would not go to that third one because they were doing what Washington did. And so that becomes, like I said, the unofficial pattern before it was actually an official one. When Washington steps down, when he announces his decision to step down, he gives a speech called what we call the farewell address. This would, and for most people, they would have been reading it. It would have been printed in papers and so forth and so on. And in this farewell address, Washington, first of all, says that he's not going to run again, which was probably very shocking to a lot of people. This had never been done before. He was the first president. Most people probably assumed the president, particularly Washington, would continue to run as long as they were able. And somebody like Washington would have certainly continued to be elected, most likely, as long as they were able to run. So that may have been very disconcerting to a lot of people. But also in this farewell address, Washington, reflects on his presidency, and he gives kind of some advice, or maybe we even might say some warnings, some kind of things that he wants the country to be mindful of as they move forward with the new administration and those kind of things. There's sort of 3 big sort of warnings or pieces of advice that Washington gives. One, he says, don't have or avoid political parties. So avoid political parties. The political parties are dangerous. Pretty much by this time, they pretty much already exist. So you can see why Washington was so concerned about that. He'd seen this happening throughout his administration with the division between Federals and Republicans. But he says that political parties are divisive. They mean that people will care about the party. They want to elevate the party. They care only about that specified interest. And that becomes what they're obsessed with. That becomes what they want to see succeed, not the country. That people's loyalty and people's affection and people's attachment needs to be to the nation, not to a group of people, not to a particular interest. He doesn't use the word political parties. He calls them factions. That's kind of a word a lot of people use. But that's what he's talking about, saying to avoid that's dangerous and divisive, and we need to be working for what's good for everybody. He also says avoid foreign alliances. Avoid foreign alliances. Foreign entanglements. We saw Washington take action to that regard during his presidency, so that makes sense that he would say that. Saying that, alliances just mean that we will get involved in wars, we'll get involved in conflicts, we will get involved in all sorts of mess that we got no business in. That what we need to do is kind of focus on ourselves. And he's not against any kind of relationships. He's not saying we shouldn't talk to anybody, we shouldn't, have any kind of anything. He specifically does mention, trade is really important. We need to have good trading relationships. We need to have good economic relationships. And that's one of the reasons why we don't want to make alliances, because if we get involved in this conflict or we get involved in this, that's going to affect our ability to conduct those economic relationships. So we need to make sure we kind of keep to ourselves and don't let those sort of things tarnish everything else. And the third thing that he warns against, and he doesn't use this word, but he is warning against something that's actually called sectionalism. Sectionalism. Section, like a section or a part of something. Sectionalism. Now, sectionalism, again, he does not use that word. He calls it something a little bit more weird. And it's something a word we've not used, but we have actually talked about this phenomenon before, and we're going to continue to talk about it a lot for the rest of the semester. Sectionalism means a division based on region. division based on region or area of the country. So divisions based on regions or areas of the country. Yes. And maybe even more than just their state, but like what? The north-south, all that sort of thing, the whole north-south-west sort of situation. And we've talked about those differences ever since, the colonial period, but Washington is specifically warning against that. No, not really. Yeah. Yeah, very much. It's quite prophetic in a lot of ways. Whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, who knows? Certainly with sectionalism, we all know where that went. That didn't turn out very well. Anyway, he doesn't say sectionalism. He says parties of geographical discrimination. That's how he puts it. But it's the same thing, similar to political parties, saying, people's loyalty, people's affection, people's, connection needs to be with the country, not with what's good for their state, what's good for their region, that we don't need to be divided based on, where we live and what's important for that particular area, but, for the whole. Washington seems to be very concerned over unity and not being divided and working what's best for everyone and those kind of things, which, always easier said than done. And interestingly, quite prophetic in a lot of things, and that most of these or all of these, we didn't hold to, at least not, some of them maybe for a long time, but certainly not forever. So Washington leaves office after that second term, and what we'll be looking at on Monday is his successor, which of course is Adams, who's going to inherit a lot of problems that didn't get worked out in the Washington presidency, or things that resulted, like from that Jay Treaty, for example, but that really didn't solve a lot of things, and it just inaugurates some new problems. And unfortunately for Adams, he's not Washington. He's not as popular as Washington. He's not as well known as Washington. He's not quite as diplomatic as he is. And also by that point, political parties are, there and, working against each other, actively working against each other. And that's going to cause some difficulties for him. So that's what we'll look at on Monday. Okay, so questions on that much? Okay, hold up just a second. Let me